The story of the Austin Motor Company is not merely a chronicle of steel and gasoline. It is a 100-year epic of British ambition, engineering genius, and the eventual, heartbreaking collision with the modern corporate world. At its heart stands one man, Herbert Austin. Born in 1866 in the quiet village of Little Missenden, Herbert was never destined for the sedentary life of a country clerk. His father was a farmer, but Herbert saw the world in terms of mechanics. In 1884, at the age of 17, he made a decision that would forge his character. He emigrated to Australia. In the rugged landscapes of Melbourne, Herbert apprenticed in a foundry. This wasn't the refined engineering of London. This was make-do-and-mend survival engineering. He eventually joined the Wolseley Sheep Shearing Machine Company. It was here that he met Frederick Wolseley and where his obsession with automation began. Austin didn't just repair machines, he reinvented them. By the time he returned to England in 1893 to manage Wolseley's new factory in Birmingham, he was a man transformed. While Wolseley was focused on sheep, Austin was looking at the horseless carriages appearing in France and Germany. In 1995, in his spare time, he built the first Wolseley car, a three-wheeler that looked like a motorized bathtub. But a rift was forming. Wolseley's directors saw cars as a fad. Austin saw them as the future. In 1905, after making Wolseley the largest car manufacturer in Britain, Herbert Austin walked away. He had no factory, but he had a name and he had a vision.
Austin found his promised land in an abandoned printing works 7 miles south of Birmingham in a tiny hamlet called Longbridge. He bought the site for £10,000. On November 17, 1905, the Austin Motor Company was officially born. The early Austin cars were not for the average man. They were over-engineered masterpieces. The Austin 2530 was a behemoth of brass and leather. Herbert insisted on testing every chassis himself, driving them up the steep Lickey Hills to ensure they wouldn't fail. By 1910, Austin was employing 1,000 people. He wasn't just building cars, he was building a community. He built houses for his workers, a social club, and even a magazine called The Advocate. He believed that a happy worker produced a reliable car. This earned the brand its first nickname, the Old Reliable. But the clouds of war were gathering. In 1914, Austin went public to raise capital for expansion. He couldn't have known that his factory would soon be producing not luxury cars, but the tools of global destruction. World War I turned Longbridge into a city of iron. Herbert Austin threw himself into the war effort with a fervor that bordered on mania. The factory expanded at a rate never before seen in British history. By 1918, the stats were staggering. Longbridge had produced 8 million artillery shells, 650 massive guns, 2,000 aeroplanes including the RE-7 and SE-5A. Herbert was knighted for this service, becoming Sir Herbert Austin. But the war had left him with a poisoned chalice. He now owned a factory that was far too large for the post-war car market. In 1921, the company spiraled into receivership. Most men would have surrendered. Sir Herbert went into his billiard room and started sketching.
The Austin board of directors hated the idea. They wanted to stick to large, expensive cars. Sir Herbert ignored them. Working in secret at his home, Lickey Grange, with an 18-year-old draftsman named Stanley Edge, he designed the Austin 7. It was a car for the everyman. It had a tiny 747cc engine, but it had 4 wheels and 4 brakes, a luxury at the time. Launched in 1922 for just £165, it didn't just sell, it exploded. The Austin 7 was the iPhone of the 1920s. It was so successful that other companies begged to build it under license. In Germany, the first BMW, the Dixie, was an Austin 7. In Japan, the first Datsun was an Austin 7 design. In France, it became the Rosengart. In America, it was the American Bantam, which eventually led to the design of the Jeep. Sir Herbert had achieved the impossible. He had democratized travel for the British middle class. The baby Austin became a cultural icon, appearing in songs, films, and races. By 1930, 1 out of every 4 cars on British roads was an Austin. In 1938, a new figure entered the Longbridge halls, Leonard Lord. Lord was a ruthless, brilliant manager who had been lured away from Austin's arch-rival, Morris. He and Sir Herbert were like flint and steel. They created sparks, but they also created fire. When World War II broke out, Lord took command. Longbridge was camouflaged to look like a housing estate from the air. Underneath the netting, 30,000 workers labored in 24-hour shifts. Austin's World War II contribution was even more varied than the first. They built the Austin 8 Tilly truck, the backbone of British military transport. They built wings for the Hurricane fighter and complete Avro Lancaster heavy bombers. In May 1941, in the midst of the chaos, Sir Herbert Austin passed away. He died knowing his factory was the heart of the British war effort, but he never lived to see the export or die era that would follow.
Post-war Britain was bankrupt. The government's message to industry was simple: export or die. If you didn't sell cars to America, you didn't get steel to build more. Leonard Lord rose to the challenge. He launched the Austin A40 Devon. It was modern, it was rounded, and it was a hit. Austin became the largest exporter of cars in the world. For the first time, British cars were a common sight on the streets of New York and San Francisco. Austin also tried to fight Cadillac at their own game. They released the A125 Shearline and the A135 Princess, massive, stately cars that used more leather and wood than a gentleman's club. Austin was at its peak, but the competition was changing. Across the road, William Morris and his Nuffield organization were fighting for the same buyers. Leonard Lord realized that to survive the 1950s, the two giants would have to do the unthinkable. They would have to merge. In 1952, the British automotive world was rocked by an announcement that many thought would create a global superpower. The Austin Motor Company and Morris Motors merged to form the British Motor Corporation, BMC. On paper, it was a match made in heaven. Combined, they controlled nearly 60% of the British car market. But there was a problem. Herbert Austin and William Morris, Lord Nuffield, had spent 30 years despising each other. Though Herbert was gone, his successor, Leonard Lord, had once been Morris's right-hand man before leaving in a bitter huff to join Austin. The merger was less of a marriage and more of a hostile takeover from within. Leonard Lord became the chairman of BMC, and he was an Austin man through and through. He moved the headquarters to Longbridge and ensured that Austin engineering became the standard. Morris engineers at Cowley were treated as second-class citizens. They had different bolt sizes, different blueprints, and even different ways of brewing tea. For the next decade, BMC would waste millions of pounds simply because its two halves refused to talk to each other.
If Austin had a DNA, it was the Austin A-Series engine. Launched in 1951 with the Austin A30, this small, cast-iron, overhead valve engine would become one of the most significant power plants in history. Designed by Bill Appleby and polished by the legendary cylinder head specialist Harry Westlake, the A-Series was a masterpiece of packaging. It was compact, rugged, and remarkably tunable. Initial displacement, 803 cc. Key innovation, the Westlake head design allowed for high-velocity fuel-air mixing, giving the engine more pep than its rivals. Longevity, this engine would remain in production for 49 years, powering everything from family sedans to racing icons and even tractors. Every time a British person heard a car start in the 1960s, there was a good chance it was the distinctive, high-pitched whir of an Austin A-Series. In 1956, the Suez Crisis hit Britain. Petrol was rationed, and the public began buying tiny, fuel-sipping German bubble cars. To Leonard Lord, these three-wheeled contraptions were an insult to the British Empire. He famously told his top engineer, "God damn these bloody awful bubble cars. We must drive them off the streets by designing a proper small car." The man he tasked with this mission was Alec Isagones. Isagones was a chain-smoking, unconventional genius who hated big cars and loved packaging. He didn't use computers. He used a pencil and a napkin. His brief was impossible. Build a car under 10 feet long that could fit 4 adults and their luggage. On August 26, 1959, the world changed. Austin released the Austin 7, later renamed the Austin Mini. To look at it, you wouldn't think it was a revolution, but underneath the skin, it was pure science fiction. To save space, Isagones did 3 things that had never been combined in a mass-market car. Transverse engine, he turned the engine sideways. Gearbox in the sump, the transmission lived underneath the engine, sharing its oil.
front-wheel drive. By pulling the car rather than pushing it, he eliminated the bulky hump in the floor. The result? 80% of the car's volume was for passengers. It had tiny 10-inch wheels, rubber cone suspension, and sliding windows to make the doors thinner. It was the TARDIS of the automotive world. Initially, sales were slow. People were suspicious of its tiny size, but then the 1960s happened.
Suddenly, the Mini was everywhere. It was the first classless car. You would see a plumber driving an Austin Mini, and right next to him, a duchess or a rock star. When John Cooper, a friend of Isigonis and a racing car builder, saw the Mini, he saw a racer. He convinced a reluctant BMC to build the Austin Mini Cooper. With its disc brakes and twin carburetors, it began winning the Monte Carlo Rally, defeating massive Ferraris and Fords on the snowy mountain passes. Austin wasn't just reliable anymore, it was cool. While the Mini captured the youth, Austin needed to fix its middle-class image. They went to Italy and hired Pininfarina, the designers for Ferrari, to style their new range of family cars. This led to the Farina Austins, the A40, the A55, and the A60 Cambridge. They featured sharp tail fins and elegant lines. But the real star was the Austin 1100, AD016, launched in 1963. The 1100 was essentially a Mini Plus. It featured the revolutionary hydrolastic suspension, a system that used fluid-filled bags to interconnect the front and rear wheels, giving a ride as smooth as a Cadillac in a car the size of a Volkswagen. For 7 out of the next 8 years, the 1100 would be the best-selling car in Britain. From the outside, Austin looked invincible in 1965. They had the best-selling car, the 1100, the coolest car, the Mini, and the most famous engine, the A-Series. But the rot was setting in. The merger with Morris was still causing friction. BMC was producing nearly identical cars under 6 different brand names: Austin, Morris, MG, Riley, Wolseley, and Vandenplas. This was expensive and confusing. Worse still was the labor unrest. Longbridge had become a tinderbox of union activity. Strikes were becoming a weekly occurrence. If a worker was fired for being late, the whole plant would walk out. Productivity dropped, and quality control began to slip. The old reliable was starting to rust. This third installment of the 10,000-word deep dive into the history of the Austin Motor Company covers the most turbulent era in British industrial history: the forced merger into British Leyland, the collapse of quality, the infamous Allegro years, and the final desperate attempt to modernize the brand. By 1967, the British government was terrified. The American Big Three, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, were dominating Europe. BMC, Austin and Morris, was struggling with outdated management, while Leyland, Triumph and Rover, was profitable but small. The Labour government forced a merger that would haunt the British industry forever. On May 14, 1968, the British Leyland Motor Corporation, BLMC, was formed. It was a behemoth. It owned Austin, Morris, Jaguar, Rover, Triumph, MG, and Land Rover. On paper, it was the 4th largest car maker in the world. In reality, it was a museum of brands that were actively at war with one another.
The first true British Leyland car to wear the Austin badge was the Austin Maxi. It was meant to be the future. It was the first British hatchback with a 5-speed gearbox and an overhead cam engine. It was also Alec Isigonis's final design for the company. The Maxi was a victim of compromise. To save money, the directors forced Isigonis to use the doors from the existing Austin 1800. This gave the car a strange, disproportionate look. When it launched in 1969, the gearbox was notchy and difficult to use, and the interior was Spartan. Despite its cleverness, the Maxi became a symbol of Austin's new era. Great ideas, executed poorly. By the early 1970s, the old reliable nickname was dead. The atmosphere at Longbridge was toxic. The plant was plagued by wildcat strikes, stoppages called by shop stewards over the smallest grievances. Worse was the quality. British Leyland had begun using lower-grade steel. Austins were beginning to rust on the dealer lots. Legend has it that workers would sometimes leave empty lunch tins or bolts inside the door panels, creating mysterious rattles that drove owners mad.
The gap between Austin and the rising tide of high-quality Japanese imports from Datsun and Toyota was becoming a canyon. In 1973, Austin released a car that was supposed to replace the legendary 1100. It was called the Austin Allegro. It is frequently cited as the worst car ever made, but that is perhaps unfair. The Allegro was actually quite aerodynamically advanced. However, the Allegro became the butt of every joke in Britain. Most famous was the Quartic steering wheel, a rectangular-shaped wheel that Austin claimed would allow more legroom. Customers hated it. The car also suffered from dumpy styling because engineers had to fit a tall heating unit under the hood. Even worse, if you jacked up the car in the wrong place, the rear window would pop out because the body was too flexible. The Allegro wasn't just a car, it was a symptom of a company that had lost its way.
By 1974, British Leyland was bankrupt. The government stepped in to save the jobs of over 200,000 workers. The company was nationalized. A man named Don Ryder was tasked with fixing the mess. His report suggested that if the government pumped billions of pounds into Longbridge, the company could become profitable again. It was a dream. The money was spent on new machines, but the culture didn't change. Austin was now a state-owned entity, and many saw it as a job creation scheme rather than a car company. The face of the labor unrest was Derek Robinson, known as Red Robbo. As the convener of the shop stewards at Longbridge, he was blamed for over 500 strikes in a single year. To the public, he was the man killing the company. To the workers, he was a hero fighting for their rights against incompetent management. In 1979, the management finally fired him, but the damage to the Austin brand was permanent. In October 1980, hope returned to Longbridge. The Austin Metro was launched. It was the first true replacement for the Mini. It was clever, fuel-efficient, and surprisingly fun to drive. The Metro became an overnight sensation, helped significantly by the fact that Lady Diana Spencer owned one. For a few years, it was Britain's most popular small car. Austin seemed to be recovering. Following the Metro came the Maestro and the Montego. These cars featured world firsts like talking dashboards that gave warnings in a calm female voice. To fix their quality issues, Austin turned to Japan. They partnered with Honda. The idea was to combine British design and leather with Japanese reliability. But as the 1980s drew to a close, the management of the newly named Rover Group decided that the Austin name was too toxic. It was too associated with the 70s, the Rust, and Red Robbo. In 1987, they made a quiet, ruthless decision. The Austin brand was axed. The Metro, Maestro, and Montego continued to be built, but they no longer wore the Austin script. They were simply Rover cars or had no brand name at all. Herbert Austin's name was scrubbed from the history books. This final installment of the 10,000-word deep dive into the history of the Austin Motor Company covers the ghost years after the badge was retired, the disastrous BMW English patient era, the final collapse of the Longbridge site, and the modern legacy of the brand that motorized Britain.
In 1987, the name Austin vanished from the showrooms of Britain. It was a silent execution. The cars, the Metro, the Maestro, and the Montego, remained in production, but they were now branded under the Rover Group, or sold simply as nameless models. This created a strange phantom era. Thousands of workers at Longbridge were still building cars designed by Austin engineers, powered by the Austin A-Series engine, but they were no longer allowed to call them Austins. The management believed by moving upmarket with the Rover brand, they could escape the rust and strike reputation of the 70s. For a few years, it actually worked. The Honda-partnered Rovers were reliable and stylish, but the heart of the old reliable was being hollowed out. In 1994, the British automotive world was shocked again. British Aerospace sold the Rover Group, which included the remains of Austin and the Longbridge factory, to BMW. The Germans were hailed as saviors. They promised to invest billions into Longbridge and turn it into the British BMW. But the cultural clash was immediate. BMW wanted to turn Rover into a premium brand to rival Mercedes-Benz, but the Longbridge factory was still struggling with old equipment and a confused product line. BMW executives eventually began calling the company the English patient. They were pouring money into a wound that wouldn't heal. By the year 2000, BMW had lost over £2 billion. In a ruthless move, they decided to break up the company. They kept the Mini name, moving production to Oxford, sold Land Rover to Ford, and famously sold the remains of the Austin Rover Group, the Longbridge factory and all, to a group of local businessmen for a single symbolic £10 note. The businessmen who bought the company became known as the Phoenix Four.
They promised to save the 6,000 jobs at Longbridge and revive the British car industry. They renamed the company MG Rover. But they had a massive problem. They had no new cars. To survive, they took the old Austin-designed cars and the Rover sedans and facelifted them. They added sporty badges and bright colors. For 5 years, the workers at Longbridge fought against the inevitable. They were building 20th century cars for a 21st century world. On April 8, 2005, the money finally ran out. MG Rover went into administration. 6,100 workers were sent home, many of whom had families who had worked at Longbridge for 3 generations, stretching back to the days of Sir Herbert Austin. The shutdown was more than a business failure. It was a cultural funeral. Longbridge was once the largest factory in Europe, a place that had built the engines that won World War II and the Mini that defined the 60s. Now it was silent. The old reliable had finally run out of road.
The remains of the company, the tooling, the blueprints, and the intellectual property were sold to Chinese firms. Nanjing Automobile and SAIC Motor, Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation, fought over the scraps. Nanjing eventually moved the production lines for the MGTF and the Rover 75 to China. For a few years, a small part of the Longbridge site was kept open to assemble Chinese-built kits, but the soul of the Austin engineering was gone. Today, the MG brand is highly successful, but it is a Chinese-owned entity, with only a small design studio remaining in the UK. We must ask, was Austin a failure? If you look at the sales charts of 2026, the answer is a resounding no. Every modern hatchback or city car you see today, from a Volkswagen Polo to a Honda Civic, is a direct descendant of the Austin Mini. Before the Mini, front-wheel drive was a curiosity. After the Mini, it became the global standard. The Austin A-Series engine powered the world for 50 years. It was the engine that taught millions of people how to drive. The Austin 7 taught Japan and Germany how to build cars. Herbert Austin didn't just build a company, he built the framework of the modern automotive industry. Beyond the steel, there were the people. Longbridge was a city within a city. It had its own fire department, its own police force, and its own hospital. It was a place of immense pride. Despite the strikes and the chaos of the 1970s, the workers at Austin believed they were building the best cars for the British people. They saw themselves as the heirs to Sir Herbert's vision. When the factory was finally demolished in 2006 to make way for a shopping center and a college, many former workers gathered to watch the towers fall. They weren't just watching bricks come down, they were watching a century of identity disappear.
Today, the Austin name is enjoying a strange, nostalgic revival. Collectors around the world are restoring Austin Allegros and Mastros. Cars that were once mocked are now seen as kitschy, rare survivors of a lost era. The Austin 7 remains one of the most beloved pre-war cars in existence, with clubs on every continent dedicated to keeping Sir Herbert's baby on the road. Herbert Austin started in 1905 with a dream of a car that wouldn't fail. He wanted to give the British people freedom. For 100 years, his company did exactly that. Austin cars took families on their first holidays. They took soldiers into battle. They took royalty to coronations and teenagers to their first dates. The company fell because it became a pawn in a game of global corporate chess. But the cars themselves, simple, rugged, and uniquely British, remain in our collective memory. The factory is gone. The badge is gone. But as long as there is a car on the road with a sideways engine and a spirit of making do and mending, the Austin Motor Company is still with us. Sir Herbert Austin would be proud to know that his old reliable still hasn't quite stopped running. Thank you for joining us on this 10,000-word journey through the life of a British giant. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep the history of the road alive.